Many, if not all of us, are probably familiar with the cranky old neighbour trope, and not necessarily just in media. Some of us may have grown up with at least rumours of the cranky old man who was constantly telling kids to get off their lawn, not wanting them to play within a 5 million mile radius of his house, stealing all the balls and frisbees that came over, etc. It's been done a lot, and I particularly do remember one guy once calling me Rambo because he thought I was ignoring him, whereas in fact I wasn't with the group of kids he was addressing and therefore didn't pay attention to it. Weird thing to call a kid, but this isn't about me, but it is tangentially related. Today, of course, we're talking The Good Neighbour, with James Caan, Logan Miller, Keir Gilchrist, Laura Innes, and a great turn by Mindy Sterling. This came as a Netflix recommendation of all things, when I was looking for something else. That does happen far too often, I think, these days. But it sounded intriguing. Sean and Ethan, Gilchrist and Miller respectively, tried to convince their neighbour Harold Graney, James Caan, that he's being haunted. It's a social science experiment that, just sidebar for a second, I don't think any review board would greenlight it. The ethical, moral implications, we know of the legal issues because of the story as it goes on, but yeah, I don't think this would be greenlit. And it is strange that both Miller and Gilchrist were in the Stanford Prison Experiment film. There's something clearly following them around here. But we're not talking about that, we're talking The Good Neighbour, and it opens with a description of an experiment that I couldn't find a specific example of. I tried various ways of searching for it and I couldn't find a real one that was exactly as stated. But it does sound very similar to a lot of conformity and interference experiments that have gone on in the past, whereby people perceive things differently, and I think that is the idea of this film. It's all about perception. A lot of people don't like the fact that it mixes the documentary / found footage style with real film work, real normal dramatic storytelling. But to me it helps with this idea that perception is key. They only see what's going on in the cameras and any audio that they have hooked up. They don't have our kind of eye in the sky, if you will. They don't have our omnipresence in any scene that we need to know information from. We can see everything. We are given that dramatic irony. And I think that's what makes the film work as well as it does. I think if it was just dramatic, classic film style, I don't think it would have the impact because we wouldn't be right there with the lads. If it was just documentary style, well, how would we get the court case bit? Because you wouldn't be able to have cameras in there. You'd have to intercut at least staged news reports or something. So I think it was a good choice in this case. And before we sort of really break down and analyse the film fully, I do want to say that I think as well as the perception theme, there is a haunting theme, but it's more that he's haunted by grief. It's more sort of a poetic haunting in a way. Although, the occasional kind of issues that seem to happen after they've staged a haunting, little glitches on the cameras and the occasional signals being lost, could that be a real haunting? I don't think it's meant to be, but it could be interesting. So early on with the film, with lines from Ethan, we can see already that he has an agenda. He's out to get Graney, quite clearly, and Sean's just along for the ride because his dad has money. Everything, we learn early on that everything was paid for pretty much by Sean's father. And Ethan is kind of manipulating and kind of abusing Sean for his own ends. Whilst the social science experiment is a great front, it's not at all Ethan's goal. It's just a way for him to be able to mess with Graney's head. But it is interesting because early on, the first situation we have, obviously the power going out, brings the police because of the silent alarm. When the power goes out, it's set that way in case anyone tries to cut power. And Sean, you can see already, is uncertain that he wants to continue. He's seeing the repercussions of his actions and realising that maybe this isn't just a fun social science experiment. This has real repercussions. And obviously the assumptions they make when May comes around to try and get Harold to sign to go into the care home. They assume it's the wife, who he abused, etc. And again, it's only with our knowledge, much later on, of course, that we can see the truth of it all. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. This is still the setup phase, and part of that is to kind of make us more on the boy's side than Graney's side. He's shown being obviously very cranky with the police officer. He's not answering the door to May, you know, he's just a very shallow existence. I mean, he's got a cat, so he can't be all bad, but, you know, for the most part, he's not meant to be likeable. And this is, again, part of reinforcing the perception idea. We're given this impression of him because this is the impression of him we're meant to have at this point. This is the impression of him the boys have at this point. It's only throughout the film and towards the end that we see the truth of the matter, but like I say, we'll save that for later. Later in the film they do mention the Little Albert experiment from the 20s, and at first I was like, well, I couldn't find the original one that was mentioned right at the start of the film, so maybe this one was made up too. And sadly it isn't. The Little Albert tale is a real thing, and yeah, like you said, you know, never fully recovered. But obviously it was the 20s, you know, ethical guidelines were a bit more lax, and it's quite telling that he's referring to something from way back then, whilst also being, you know, trying to say this was a morally reprehensible thing, you know, this is awful, torturing this poor boy, but not seeing the irony almost that that's kind of what they're doing to Graney, but he's fine with it. I mean, I think there is an element of, you know, maybe we should stop because of this, but he's not. Sean throughout is kind of a bit, I don't like to say, but a bit kind of weak. He's not willing to just go, you know what, no, this is far enough. Whatever repercussions happen now is going to be probably better than whatever happens down the line, and obviously, as we know, he would be right if he came forward. A bit like Caesar in the Let Us Pray video, you know, if he'd just have the courage to come forward and go, I'm not comfortable, I want to confess, I don't want this to carry on, it would be so much better. But again, you know, he's drawn along in Ethan's own motivations. And part of that, obviously, he does the little funny song about 1 million views.
I would spend eternity just to get 1 million views. I don't give a f about you. All I want is 1 million views.
Now, as we see at the end, and I probably will come back to it, you know, they do get the fame and notoriety, just not in the way they'd hope. And Ethan is quite cold and calculating and logical. He seems like he's just, you know, very much out for fun, out for a laugh, very irreverent to everything. But he is logical when Sean raises concerns, although it is a logic that's used obviously to his own ends and to continue his torture, really, of a grieving old man. You know, when he's saying, look what will happen. This is what scares Sean out of going to the police. But of course we learn, you know, later on in the film about the history that they have. The fact that his dad didn't just leave. His dad was kind of abusive, and Graney helped his mum out of that situation. So I think that's where the title of the film really comes into play. Graney, as much as he's painted as not being so, is the good neighbour. He's done good for Ethan's family. So he's a good guy, surely. And as we see at the end, the amount of things that he did that no one should be asked to do means he is an all-round good person. But, like I say, it's all about perception. We are constantly given one angle, and we're made to hate this guy for no good reason, as we find out. And even the prosecutor draws the same kind of conclusions, that basically Ethan is holding a grudge because Graney's actions made his dad go away. And it's wrong, but he's a child, of course, you know. He's not seeing it straight. But there are certain elements of his personality that made me come to the conclusion, whilst I was watching it, that he could be a candidate for narcissistic personality disorder. We've all heard of the term narcissist, I'm sure. Someone who's very self-centered, out to get themselves, but I think his is pathological. I think it's very ingrained, and it is possibly due to the loss of his father as much as anything. He's scared of people abandoning him. This is quite common in NPD. And, you know, the fact that he thinks just saying sorry to Sean after the whole Halloween incident fixes everything. You know, he says it afterwards. It's like, well, I said sorry. What more do you want? This is very typical. You know, they think that if they just give platitudes, then everything will be fine. I don't think he's full-blown psychopath. He's not quite that level, so that's why I think it's maybe more NPD. I mean, obviously, I'm not a psychiatrist or anything, but looking into it with my knowledge of personality disorders, etc., it does seem very, very, very likely. But they continue. Wrongly, obviously, as we find out. And, of course, Ethan ends up finding the bell when he tries to go and sort out the camera in the den. And this leads, obviously, to the end. It's interesting to see how Graney's still primed for the bell. You know, we don't know how long ago it was that Caroline left him, but he's still primed. It gets him up straight away, no questions asked. And it's too much for him. He's reached breaking point and he just shoots himself. And it's very harrowing as a scene, and we do get all the information finally. We do get the fact that, you know, he did fix the door after she asked him to. The dancing because, you know, she had some horrible news and she just wanted to feel better. It wasn't that he was being abusive. It wasn't an affair. They were setting up a new bed for her. And the bell, of course, was her way of summoning him when he wanted to make sure she was saving her energy on getting well. And, yeah, it's very sad. We have gone through this film thinking, God, this Graney's a piece of work. But actually, he's just a decent guy who was dealt a bad hand and tried to help his neighbourhood. I think he's entitled to be a little grumpy in his older age. He's not had the best life. No one has a perfect life, I'm sure, but he's kind of earned a little bit of crotchetiness, and as far as we can see in the film, he's never been out and out violent to anyone. He's never been wrongfully aggressive. He's just tried to just disappear, if you will. He's just tried to get on with his life. And it is quite sad. But, you know, we only learn this at the end, and again it reinforces this perception idea. And of course, our perception of the boys changes as well as from the girls. You know, we see them turn away from them, kind of disowning them at the court. But then we do see, and this may be just me, sort of perception coming into play again, I guess, but the beginnings of a smile or a smirk on Ethan's face, because he's getting his 1 million views, he's getting the fame and notoriety that he so craves. And I really think he'll just see this as a slap on the wrist. He's got off very lightly because of it being, you know, sort of misdemeanors. But Sean will learn from this. Sean will change. Sean will never trust Ethan again, but, you know, he'll develop into a good citizen, a good neighbour, maybe, at some point down the line, and grow from it. Ethan will not. But, I mean, I don't want to give anyone just a blanket pass because of pathological or psychological issues. I think that's wrong, but we do need to take it into consideration. If he does have some kind of personality disorder, whether it be narcissistic or otherwise, although that does seem most likely from my knowledge, maybe that should be addressed, because if it isn't, he's very likely to repeat his old mistakes, and of course at that point he will have a record, punishments will be more severe, and the prison system isn't really set up to handle psychological reform, if you will. So I do think that would be a great thing for him to get, but of course, you know, that's got to be offered or even identified. And from what I can see so far, I don't think it has been, and he's quite content with that. But yeah, this is a film definitely about perception and being haunted by grief. It's definitely been a theme, you know, sort of death and grief, I think, for the past few weeks, and I do have one or two more coming up, but I promise we'll get a bit happier towards the end of the year. But I did want to cover this as soon as I saw it, pretty much, because there was a lot to think on. Like I say, about perception, how we're guided down one path, and then actually, this guy's quite decent. Maybe people we know who seem angry all the time, who seem just hermit-like, maybe they have something deeper going on, and maybe we should give them a bit of leniency. So until next time, as always, take care.